The blood covered his hands. His stomach felt like it had leapt into his throat. Sweat dripped from his forehead. He was in panic. What now, he thought. After taking a moment to look around, he saw that there was no one. So he took the dead body and hid it. The next day, he was tired. He didn't sleep well and continued to go back and forth whether or not it was right that he had murdered a man. Guilt was beginning to overwhelm him. But he had work to do. At work, there was a fight between two people, and he went to try to mediate so that they would stop. It was then that his newfound greatest fear had surfaced. They knew what he had done. "Who had made you commander and judge over us?" they said. "Are you planning to kill me just like you killed the Egyptian?" He was found out. There was no getting around it. So he fled town, hoping of finding a place where he could start over. Moses was a fugitive on the run in search of a new life and a new start. He spent years trying to repair that life that was altered in just a matter of minutes. That was what sin does. It lasts for just a glimmer of a moment, but it affects an abundance of moments afterwards. Sin changes lives, and Moses was a living proof. He settled in modern-day Saudi Arabia, the ancient region of Midian. He got a job as a shepherd, and by all accounts, things were going well for him. Did he still deal with his guilt and shame from the past? We can only imagine the sleepless nights, the negative thoughts. He had left Egypt, but it's likely that his past was still on his back. He was an orphan, a murderer. At any given moment, he could dig through his baggage and find those labels. But then, Moses was in the field tending his flock as a shepherd when something caught the corner of his eye. He had never seen anything like this. It was a bush covered with flames, but the flames did not consume the bush. Moses was used to seeing a normal result of fire, and that's destruction. But this fire was different, far different. These were not ordinary flames. These were heavenly flames. These flames spoke. These flames knew him. These flames had a mission for Moses. God decided to show himself to this orphan murderer, this on-the-run fugitive. And he did so when Moses least expected it. That's what God does. Sometimes he shows up out of nowhere. Sometimes God decides to shake the rust off of our hearts in ways that we just cannot calculate or prepare for. God knew that Moses' heart was broken. He knows the same thing about us. He knows that sometimes we need him to break through the barriers we've built to keep him out so he can have our full attention. God spoke through the flames to Moses, and he said, "Moses, Moses." The dialogue began. That's how it started. That's when God says to this man who ran for his life, would he list all the things that he did wrong and command him to make penance for his sins? What would Moses do? Where would he run? Who would listen to him? God spoke to him, not about Moses' sin, but about the plight of the Israelites. Back and forth they went. Moses was being called by God to a great work for the Israelite people, but Moses focused on himself and his own limitations, kept him from responding with a resounding yes. But Moses did what he always did. Most of our focus is given on ourselves. We think about the good and the bad in our lives. We are self-focused to the point that we assume that everyone else is focused on us too. We then assume that everyone else feels about the same way that we feel about us. When God called Moses to go to Pharaoh, Moses responded with reason after reason on why he wasn't the guy for the job, all the while ignoring the fact that God was God, and he could do in him and through him what he couldn't do for himself. Moses had it in his mind that he was disqualified for being used by God. If we looked into his resume, we probably would lend to agree. After all, the guy was a murderer. That's pretty a big deal. But God was not hindered by Moses' disqualifications because Moses is more than able to cover, or God is more than able to cover our shortcomings. But Moses had to surrender, and eventually he did. Moses surrendered to God in the face of his own shortcomings and his own sin. paved the way for a life lived for God. Moses became a leader, a prophet, a man of God. Yes, he was a murderer. He murdered someone. Yes, he was an orphan. Yes, he probably still dealt with his past baggage. But the biggest yes in Moses' life was now that he was about God, and God had called him and rescued him. Moses was the epitome of messy, but God still decided to use him in a powerful way. It doesn't matter what we think our qualifications are, disqualifications are. God can always cover us with his qualifications and use us still to be used in the degree that we see and we focus on him, his power, rather than ourselves and our regrets. What used to be used by God, it began with the word surrender.